We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The ice on Lake Havers had always been unpredictable, a glittering mirror over black water that promised adventure and concealment in equal measure. On February 6, 1999, the cold arrived earlier than the forecast predicted, a hard, dry cold that cracked window panes and silenced the forest that ringed the lake. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees below zero, and the only sounds were the mechanical drone of wind and the faint hum of engines from the handful of residents who refused to let winter dictate their routines. Among them was 27-year-old graduate student Ellen Reiss, a second-year candidate in environmental biology at the University of Vermont, who'd rented a cabin on the lake's northern shore to complete her thesis on freshwater algal bloom dynamics. She'd spent the past 4 months collecting core samples and ice measurements, documenting seasonal nutrient fluctuations with the precision of someone who found comfort in data and solitude. Her supervisor described her as methodical, introverted, and skeptical of shortcuts, a scientist more comfortable with microscopes than with people. That Friday evening, around 8:10 p.m., 2 neighbors watched Ellen drive her aging Subaru into the shared lot behind her cabin. The vehicle's headlights swept briefly across the frozen lake before disappearing as she parked beside the snowmobile she'd purchased second-hand from a hardware store in nearby St. Albans. The machine's blue paint was chipped and dull, but Ellen had maintained it meticulously, following repair manuals like scripture. She told a colleague earlier that week that she planned one last night run before her fieldwork concluded. A short loop across the lake to measure ice thickness near the southern inlet where springs kept the freeze unstable. The storm warnings posted that afternoon hadn't changed her mind. At 9:07 p.m., a resident on the eastern shore noticed twin beams of light cutting steadily across the lake's surface, white arcs reflected against the crusted snow. He would later tell investigators that the snowmobile maintained a straight path toward the inlet, slowed briefly, then extinguished its lights as if switched off deliberately. The silence that followed was absolute. No crash, no splash, no echo, just darkness spreading across the frozen expanse. When dawn came, the storm had veiled everything under 4 new inches of powder. Ellen's Subaru remained parked in the lot, its windshield frosted, a thermos of coffee half full in the cup holder. Her cabin door was locked from the inside, the wood stove cold but set for kindling. On the small desk beside her field notes lay a topographic map of Lake Havers marked with red pencil lines denoting transect routes. The final line, dated February 6th, extended halfway across the lake and stopped. Deputy Miles Denton, the first responder from Addison County Sheriff's Department, arrived shortly after 8:30 a.m. The report he filed would become the foundation for one of Vermont's most confounding missing person cases. Denton described clear tire tracks leading from the main road to Ellen's cabin, fresh as of the previous evening. He followed her boot prints from the front steps to the snowmobile, then from the snowmobile out onto the frozen lake, where they vanished beneath wind-blown snow about 20 feet from shore. There were no return prints, no sign of disturbance. The snowmobile itself was gone. Denton's initial assumption was mechanical failure, a fall through weak ice near the inlet. But when rescue divers arrived 2 days later, they found no sign of a break, no discolored water, no submerged vehicle, and no body. The ice thickness measured between 10 and 12 inches, sufficient to support a loaded pickup truck. The sonar sweep revealed only solid reflection, undisturbed strata, and trapped air pockets that predated the storm. Ellen Reiss had simply vanished across a lake that, according to every instrument, remained perfectly intact. Media attention arrived quickly, drawn by the eerie symmetry of her disappearance and the phrase locals adopted to describe it. The lights that went out on Havers. Photographs of Ellen, serious brown eyes, thick parka zipped to her chin, snow goggles hanging loosely around her neck, circulated across New England. Her mother, Dr. Helen Reiss, a retired physics teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, arrived within 24 hours, transforming the small sheriff's office into a command post. She carried a leather binder labeled Search Log and began documenting every conversation, every observation, every unconfirmed sighting. Within a week, she knew every volunteer by name, every local trail by mile marker. She asked questions no one else had considered: whether radar interferometry could detect voids under ice, whether lake methane could create acoustic illusions mistaken for engine sounds, whether changes in atmospheric pressure could mimic lights extinguishing mid-crossing, Investigators humored her at first, but her relentless logic soon became indispensable. The official theory evolved slowly. By February 10th, state police divers had completed a full grid search of the southern inlet. The ice was thick and unbroken. The absence of evidence became its own anomaly. Denton's notes show growing unease, impossible conditions, vehicle missing without surface breach. Recommend reclassification as suspicious disappearance. On February 12th, searchers found Ellen's helmet lying upright near the lake's western bank, 700 meters from the inlet and directly atop solid, unfractured ice. The visor was open, the chin strap unfastened. Inside the helmet, investigators found a single fragment of yellow birch pollen, a detail that would seem meaningless for 20 years. There were no fingerprints other than Ellen's, and the snow around the helmet was untouched, as if placed gently rather than dropped. The find deepened the mystery instead of clarifying it. News outlets framed it as the Vermont counterpart to Michigan's locked room enigmas, a disappearance too orderly to be random, too clean to be natural. Reporters descended on the lakeside diner where locals exchanged theories about thin ice, criminal foul play, or abduction by opportunists traveling the frozen backroads. Denton hated the attention, hated the way they used phrases like vanished without a trace, while he drove the perimeter roads every night, headlights glancing off endless white emptiness. He visited Ellen's cabin repeatedly, looking for anything new. The notes she left behind were obsessively detailed, columns of temperature data, graphs of chlorophyll density, and meticulous timestamps for each ice core extraction. But one margin note caught his eye during his third reading. Neighbor's attic vents, possible contamination source, inspect insulation. The line seemed inconsequential, an academic reminder, until Denton realized that Ellen's nearest neighbor, Norman Cleary, lived less than a quarter-mile inland and was one of the last people to see her alive. Cleary, a 54-year-old former maintenance worker for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, had been friendly but reserved during initial questioning. He told deputies that he'd seen Ellen working on her snowmobile the afternoon before the disappearance and had waved from his porch. He denied visiting her cabin or the lake that night, claiming he'd stayed indoors repairing a generator. Denton logged the statement without suspicion, but as days passed and the physical trail grew colder, Cleary's proximity began to feel more significant. On February 14th, 1 week after Ellen's disappearance, Denton obtained permission to inspect Cleary's property for potential evidence of snowmobile passage or unusual activity. What he found would remain buried in reports until forensic science caught up 2 decades later. Faint tread marks behind Cleary's shed, consistent with snowmobile skis, and a single torn page from an outdated ice rescue manual published in 1987, the kind used by state conservation officers before electronic training modules replaced them. The page was crumpled, stained, and half frozen into the snow, detailing procedures for concealing rescue holes during staged training drills. Cleary dismissed the page as junk left from his employment years earlier. Denton noted it, bagged it, and moved on, never knowing that it was the first tangible link between Ellen Reiss's academic curiosity and the man whose attic insulation would one day rewrite Vermont's coldest mystery. By February's third week, Lake Havers had frozen into silence so complete that sound seemed to die before it reached the air. The volunteer search teams dwindled to half a dozen locals and a handful of graduate students who refused to abandon their friend. They combed the frozen expanse with ice augers and handheld sonar, each strike of the blade echoing like hollow drum beats across the white plain. Ellen's mother, Helen Reiss, had converted her daughter's cabin into a makeshift operations post, its walls covered in maps, data printouts, and lists of phone numbers that led nowhere. On the dining table, she arranged coffee mugs labeled Denton, Rescue, Media, and Me, to keep track of whose presence the small space could bear at any given hour. Every morning at 7, she'd record the air temperature, wind direction, and humidity, a habit inherited from Ellen's own meticulous research logs, as though keeping the same data might hold her daughter in the realm of the measurable. The investigation's rhythm hardened into routine. Search, interview, document, repeat. Deputy Miles Denton had become the point man between local law enforcement and the state investigators who rotated through the case. He didn't trust them. They arrived in unmarked SUVs, promised advanced techniques, and left within days when the absence of leads made the case toxic to their statistics. Denton remained, anchored by a stubborn sense of obligation. Each night he'd walk the lake's northern edge under the beam of his maglite, tracing where Ellen's tracks had vanished. He'd imagine her snowmobile light cutting through the dark, the moment the beams blinked out, the instant when physics failed to explain the evidence. Inside the sheriff's office, the whiteboard labeled Ellen R. filled with theories. 1. Accident through ice, no brake found. 2. Voluntary disappearance, contradicts personality plans. 3. Foul play, no motive evidence. 4. Unknown event. Denton hated the fourth category. Unknown was a word that meant surrender disguised as professionalism. On February 18th, a new piece of evidence arrived, not from the lake, but from a highway rest area 30 miles north. A maintenance worker reported finding fragments of blue fiberglass embedded in a snowbank near the plow turnoff. The pieces matched the color of Ellen's snowmobile. Forensics confirmed paint composition consistent with Yamaha models manufactured between 1993 and 1996. The fragments were small, too small to indicate a full collision, more likely scraped off during transport. Denton's report phrased it bluntly. Vehicle may have been moved post-incident. The theory shifted again, from disappearance to abduction. Helen refused to leave Vermont. She spent nights sleeping in Ellen's bed, her daughter's scent long since absorbed by the dry cabin air, and woke each morning to a conviction that logic could outlast grief. She began contacting university colleagues, asking if Ellen had mentioned fear, conflict, or a new relationship. Most described her as isolated but content. One classmate, however, recalled a tense phone call in January where Ellen complained about contamination from nearby insulation. The student had dismissed it as research frustration. Helen did not. She dug into Ellen's field notebooks, cross-referencing sample sites with property boundaries. Cleary's name appeared twice, once labeled N shore control, and once in parentheses beside airborne particulate. When Denton re-interviewed Norman Cleary on February 21st, the man seemed irritated rather than nervous. He repeated his statement about staying indoors, emphasized his arthritis, his generator repair, his distance from anything resembling foul play. Denton noted that Cleary's house smelled faintly of chemical solvent, though the source was unidentifiable. The attic hatch in the hallway ceiling hung slightly ajar. Cleary explained it away. Draft insulation work, nothing unusual. Denton logged the observation and left, uneasy but constrained by warrant limitations. By early March, snowmelt had begun carving channels through the drifts, exposing layers of frozen sediment along the lake edges. A fisherman discovered a rusted fuel can and a torn length of bungee cord tangled in cattails. Forensics later confirmed traces of gasoline consistent with snowmobile-grade fuel. The evidence proved motion, transport, but no origin or destination. Reporters returned. Headlines revived the phrase, "the lights that went out," resurrecting public fascination that the sheriff's department had hoped to bury. When the spring thaw finally broke the ice, divers resumed the search, this time with remote cameras and ground-penetrating sonar. They mapped every depression, every trapped air bubble, every submerged branch. Still no trace of the snowmobile. The water yielded only silt and shadows. Ellen's case transitioned officially to inactive investigation, pending new evidence. Helen never accepted the phrasing. She wrote letters to the governor, to the university's president, to national journalists. Only one reply ever came, from a retired hydrologist who theorized that thermal vents could have created temporary sinkholes capable of swallowing small vehicles. Helen considered it, then rejected it. "Sinkholes don't place helmets neatly on the ice," she wrote back. Years passed with the slow decay of unsolved cases. Denton transferred to the state's cold case division in 2006, bringing Ellen's file with him. He kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk, unopened most weeks but never forgotten. The file thickened with each false lead. A woman's remains found near Montpelier, wrong dental records. A confession from a drifter in Maine, recanted. A rusted frame pulled from the Lamoille River, different model. Each disappointment pushed the truth further into the realm of folklore. In 2017, advances in environmental DNA sampling gave cold case units across the country new tools. Denton, nearing retirement, requested re-examination of materials from the Reiss case. Among them were microscopic samples taken from the birch pollen fragment found inside the helmet. Previous labs had dismissed it as environmental noise. But the new sequencing revealed something unusual. Trace DNA from a second individual, male, age estimated mid-40s at the time of contact. The amount was minute, but the profile matched a partial sequence stored in Vermont's Department of Natural Resources employment records. Norman P. Cleary. Denton's hands trembled when the lab report arrived. The name was still written in his own handwriting from 18 years earlier. He drove back to Lake Havers that same evening, parking outside Cleary's now dilapidated house. Snow fell the way it had that winter night, soft and continuous, muting sound. The property looked abandoned, but a faint yellow light glowed behind an upstairs curtain. Denton's knock went unanswered. Through the frost-coated window he could see shelves cluttered with tools, a half-empty whiskey bottle, and stacks of old manuals. He recognized the red spine of one instantly, the Vermont Ice Rescue Guide, 1987 edition. Cleary was found dead 2 weeks later, natural causes according to the coroner, heart failure in his sleep. During property clearance, an environmental contractor reported strange insulation in the attic. Thick layers of cellulose mixed with shredded fabric that didn't match any standard material. Samples were taken for hazard testing. They revealed human hair fibers, degraded textile threads consistent with synthetic snowmobile gear, and, most chillingly, bone microfragments containing DNA matching Ellen Reiss. The attic became the new crime scene. Investigators reconstructed a hypothesis that defied conventional reasoning. Sometime after Ellen's disappearance, Cleary had used cellulose insulation to conceal remains, possibly transferred from another location. The house's original construction connected the attic to an unused ventilation shaft, leading to an exterior storage shed. Within that shaft, forensic teams found a metal hook and cable system, likely repurposed from rescue equipment. Tool markings matched those on the torn manual page recovered in 1999. What had once seemed an impossible vanishing now unfolded as meticulous staging by a man who understood ice, weight distribution, and the psychology of search operations. Cleary's years with fish and wildlife had taught him how to cut, refreeze, and disguise ice fractures using slush infill techniques developed for rescue simulations. He'd known exactly how to make it appear as though no breach existed. The final reconstruction, detailed in Denton's 2018 report, described a chilling sequence. Cleary intercepted Ellen near shore, under the pretense of assisting with her measurements. He struck her, how or with what remained uncertain, then used his modified rescue gear to lower her and the snowmobile into a shallow cavity formed during prior thaw cycles. He poured refreezing agents and shoveled slush until the surface solidified seamlessly. The next morning's snowfall erased the rest. Later, he retrieved selected items, the helmet, perhaps as a macabre experiment, and stored or destroyed the rest of the evidence over time. When insulation replacement became necessary, he hid what remained above his ceiling, sealed beneath decades of dust and guilt. For Denton, closure brought no relief. He'd spent half his career circling this case, only to realize that the answers had always been within shouting distance of the cabin where it began. Helen Reiss, now 75, attended the final press briefing in Burlington. She stood before cameras and reporters, her expression devoid of triumph. "It was never about monsters," she said. "It was about people who know how to hide things." The Lake Havers case officially closed on December 3, 2018. The report ran 312 pages. The Sheriff's Department issued a brief statement of gratitude to agencies that assisted. But within the file's final appendix, a single handwritten line appeared in blue ink, the last entry ever made by Deputy Miles Denton before his retirement. "The lights never went out. We just stopped looking in the dark." The story might have ended with Cleary's death and the discovery in his attic, but nothing about Lake Havers ever stayed buried for long. By early 2019, word of the attic insulation findings had leaked through state records requests filed by regional journalists. What began as a paragraph in a Burlington Free Press article expanded into a full-length investigative series titled "The Quiet Predator Next Door." The tone was forensic, restrained, clinical, exactly the kind of coverage that stoked both fascination and unease. Within days, national true crime networks began calling the Addison County Sheriff's Department, requesting interviews, archival photos, and footage from the original 1999 search. The sheriff's new media liaison refused most requests, but the story had already escaped official containment. For the residents around Lake Havers, Exposure reopened wounds they had learned to live with by ignoring. Houses that had once framed their lakefront views as peaceful now looked out over a stage set for horror. Younger families who'd moved in after 2000 whispered about the Cleary place and pointed to the boarded-up windows as if evil could be. Quarantined behind plywood. Real estate listings for the area quietly removed mention of lake access. Children who grew up hearing fragments of the legend. The girl scientist, the missing snowmobile, the impossible ice, now watched as television crews filmed reenactments on the frozen shore, actors dressed in parkas and safety goggles mimicking a night they could never fully imagine. Detective Miles Denton, retired only a few months, found himself drawn back into the orbit of the case he had promised to leave behind. The Vermont Cold Case Review Board invited him to sit as a consultant for post-investigation documentation, primarily to verify the chain of custody for evidence recovered from Cleary's property. He accepted reluctantly, knowing that any return risked reopening his own unresolved guilt. He spent long afternoons in a state archive room, examining bagged insulation fragments under fluorescent light. The cellulose looked ordinary, gray, fibrous, almost weightless, but the labels in red ink carried unbearable gravity. Attic sample No. 7, human trace, DNA match, REIS. He signed the confirmation forms mechanically, yet his mind replayed that first winter search, the glare of the floodlights on ice, the unanswered radio static, the helmet sitting pristine against the snow like a punctuation mark that had waited 2 decades for its sentence. By March, the Reiss case file became a mandatory training module for the state's forensic fieldwork program. Cadets studied it as an example of evidence degradation over time and the risks of cognitive bias in early investigations. The official lesson emphasized how initial assumptions about environmental accidents could blind investigators to human factors. Unofficially, the story served as a cautionary ghost tale about the limits of procedure. Helen Reiss cooperated with journalists, but on her own terms. She refused interviews that sought dramatization, granting access only to a documentary project from a local public television affiliate. The production team filmed her walking the lake's perimeter at dusk, carrying a folder of Ellen's field notes like a relic. Her narration was soft, factual. The lake keeps what it wants, but even ice remembers pressure. The final episode aired that fall, dedicated to missing persons in rural regions. The segment on Ellen's disappearance drew over 500,000 viewers, and donations flooded the university scholarship fund Helen had established in her daughter's name. The visibility brought solace but also unwanted correspondence, letters from amateur sleuths, psychics, and conspiracy theorists who insisted that Cleary could not have acted alone. Some claimed government cover-ups. Others invoked supernatural explanations, blending the scientific mystery with folklore. Helen answered none of them. The resurgence of attention forced law enforcement to reopen certain procedural questions. If Cleary had murdered Ellen, what had driven him? He had no record of violence, no documented history of obsession or harassment, beyond the vague discomfort reported by a few hospital staff decades earlier. Forensic psychologists contracted by the state compiled a posthumous profile. Socially isolated male, high need for control, likely narcissistic personality structure reinforced by decades of unnoticed entitlement. They noted the symmetry between Cleary's former occupation, training others to rescue, and his eventual crime, the inversion of saving into hiding. Their report concluded that Cleary's motive was less about desire than about dominance over circumstance, the creation of an unsolvable puzzle that would keep his name unspoken but immortal. Denton attended the board's debrief sessions quietly, offering factual corrections and minor clarifications. He refused to speculate about motive. "We'll never know," he said. "All we have are the results of a man who learned how to vanish things." Yet even as he spoke, a part of him doubted total closure. Certain inconsistencies lingered. Timestamps on Cleary's utility bills that didn't align with known movements. Traces of another unidentified male DNA sample recovered from the same attic joist that held Ellen's remains. The lab had labeled it contaminant, possibly from investigators, but Denton's instincts rebelled. He logged a confidential memo suggesting follow-up analysis. The memo was filed, acknowledged, and quietly forgotten. That spring, snowmelt swelled the lake until it touched the lower trunks of birch trees lining the shore. Locals reported debris washing up, scraps of metal, a broken ski runner, pieces of fiberglass. The sheriff's department retrieved the objects, though none could be conclusively linked to Ellen's snowmobile. Still, rumors multiplied. Some insisted that Cleary had an accomplice who helped move the vehicle. Others claimed he'd sunk it deep in an abandoned quarry and used the lake story as misdirection. The mythology fed itself, the way rural stories always did, one neighbor repeating another's uncertainty until speculation hardened into memory. Helen visited the recovered site only once more. It was June, and the lake had turned mirror-smooth, reflecting clouds like bruises. She placed a small brass tag engraved with Ellen's initials near the waterline and left without ceremony. She didn't attend the dedication of the memorial plaque later installed by the university. Public mourning, she said, had begun to feel like performance. Meanwhile, the Vermont Bureau of Investigation transferred all Cleary-related evidence to a climate-controlled facility in Montpelier. Among the boxes were several items cataloged as non-evidentiary personal effects: notebooks, manuals, and a stack of old photographs. An intern tasked with digitizing the materials noticed that some images depicted training exercises on Lake Havers in the late 1980s. One photograph showed Cleary standing beside a younger man, both wearing orange rescue vests, smiling before a freshly cut square of ice. Written on the back in faded ink were the words Demo 4, 1989, with MH. The initials meant nothing to the intern, but when the metadata reached Denton's inbox, he recognized them immediately. Mark Havers, the lake's namesake family descendant who had sold Cleary his property years earlier. The connection reignited old suspicions. The Havers family owned extensive land around the lake and had operated private ice rescue workshops through the 1980s. Records indicated that Cleary had been both employee and tenant. If another participant had been involved, even peripherally, it complicated the narrative of a solitary predator. Denton requested follow-up interviews with surviving Havers relatives. Most declined. One cousin, living in Maine, admitted that Mark had vanished from town around 1990 after some disagreement over training accidents. No body, no report, just another absence folded into Vermont's quiet geography. For the media, these details were fuel. New headlines reframed the story as The Havers Curse, a lineage of vanishing men and women bound by the lake's icy logic. Podcasts dissected the case across multiple episodes, layering sound effects of cracking ice under somber narration. True crime enthusiasts on online forums debated the physics of ice refreezing, exchanging satellite images and speculative coordinates. To Denton, the noise felt like contamination. Too many voices drowning the few facts left. By 2020, the COVID pandemic emptied the lakefront of visitors. Film crews canceled and silence reclaimed the shoreline. Denton found a strange peace in the isolation. He began writing his memoir, not for publication but for the record. He titled the manuscript Thermal Layer, Notes from an Unfinished Search. The opening line read, "You never solve a disappearance. You only learn which details refuse to disappear." In longhand, he recounted the early days of the search. Helen's persistence, Cleary's calculated ordinariness, and the way memory could refreeze events until the truth became a fossil under ice. In November of that year, state archivists completed the digitization of Cleary's photographs. Hidden among them was one final image overlooked during initial cataloging, an aerial shot of Lake Havers taken from a small plane in March 1999, weeks after Ellen vanished. The ice showed a faint rectangular discoloration near the western bank, the same area where her helmet had been found. Computer enhancement revealed faint parallel lines extending from the rectangle toward Cleary's property, like tracks refrozen and buried beneath layers of snow. The photograph confirmed what Denton had long suspected. Cleary had created not one, but multiple false surfaces, decoys designed to mislead divers toward the deeper inlet while he worked near shore. This revelation closed the last procedural gap in the official record. Yet for those who lived around Lake Havers, certainty brought little comfort. Every winter the ice formed again, smooth and pale, erasing all scars. Locals still avoided crossing after dark. Fishermen reported hearing distant mechanical hums beneath the surface, sounds that vanished when approached. They called it Ellen's engine, a superstition born from grief and echoed through generations. When Denton died in 2022, his will requested his ashes be scattered on the north shore where the search had begun. Helen, frail but lucid, attended the quiet ceremony. watched the gray dust sink into the same waters that had held her daughter for so long, and said nothing. The last surviving witness to the beginning of the mystery understood what the rest never would, that silence was not absence but density, the weight of all that could never be fully explained. The Lake Havers file remains closed in the Vermont Bureau archives. Its final notation reads simply, "Case resolved, subject located, cause determined." But inside the margin of the master report, an unknown clerk penciled a question mark next to the word determined. It has never been erased. By the winter of 2023, Lake Havers had become less a place than a symbol. College students at the University of Vermont whispered about it in the same breath as Roanoke and Dyatlov Pass, enigmas wrapped in cold. A generation too young to remember the original disappearance grew up on documentaries that reduced Ellen Reiss to a grainy photograph, a young woman in a parka staring past the camera into a future she would never reach. In Burlington's bookstores, paperbacks with titles like Vanished on the Ice and The Havers Equation filled true crime shelves. Each author promised a definitive account, though none could resist embellishment. One claimed Ellen's fieldwork had uncovered illegal toxic dumping beneath the lake. Another insisted she had been running from a secret romance with Cleary himself. Helen Reiss read none of them. She had learned that retellings were just new forms of disappearance. The only people still confronting the case as fact were scientists. In 2023, a joint research initiative between the Vermont Geological Survey and the State Forensic Lab launched a project using ground-penetrating radar and hyperspectral imaging to map ice formations across thaw-refreeze cycles. The goal was practical, predictive models for rescue operations, but inevitably journalists linked it to Lake Havers. The team's lead analyst, Dr. Reina Cortez, studied Cleary's methods with academic detachment. In her report, she called his staging an unintentional masterclass in forensic delay, noting that by exploiting natural processes of freeze layering, Cleary had transformed the environment itself into a collaborator. Cortez's algorithms reconstructed how refreezing slush could seal a cavity without visible scarring. The simulation confirmed Denton's reconstruction almost precisely, vindicating his intuition decades after the fact. But in validating the science, the study also exposed how easily evidence could still vanish beneath time and weather. Every winter erases its own crimes, Cortez wrote. The research team's findings circulated online, reigniting public fascination. Amateur investigators parsed the open-source data as if decoding scripture. Drone hobbyists flew over Lake Havers capturing aerial mosaics, convinced they could still locate the submerged Snowmobile. On social media, Lake Havers trended for weeks. Users layered historical photos over satellite maps, marking supposed anomalies, faint rectangular shadows, parallel lines in the ice. To trained eyes, they were nothing but melt channels, but the images carried their own momentum. The more digital evidence appeared, the less the public seemed to believe the official story. Meanwhile, in Montpelier, archivists continued cataloging boxes from the Cleary estate. Among them lay a notebook overlooked during earlier processing. Its cover was water-stained, its pages filled with cramped mechanical handwriting, lists of weights, freezing times, and chemical ratios. Interspersed were fragments of sentences. She trusts cold, surface holds what silence hides, the lake forgives structure. The prose was half scientific, half confession. Analysts debated whether the entries represented Cleary's reflections or drafts for some training manual that blurred into obsession. One page listed several names and dates, corresponding to past winter rescue participants from the late 1980s. Cross-referencing revealed that 2 of those men had died in unrelated accidents within years of each other. Another, Mark Havers, remained officially missing, though nothing directly tied these names to Ellen's case. The implication was unsettling, that Cleary's fascination with control over ice and rescue may have stemmed from older tragedies buried under institutional silence. A local journalist named Theo Danvers seized on the notebook. His long-form piece, The Weight of Water, Secrets Beneath Lake Havers, argued that the tragedy was not an isolated act of violence but the culmination of a culture that prized stoicism and secrecy over accountability. He traced a lineage from the Fish and Wildlife Department's underfunded rescue programs to the negligence that allowed someone like Cleary to operate unsupervised. The article won regional awards and reignited debate about rural oversight and resource cuts in the 1990s. But what resonated most was Danvers's closing line. Ellen Reiss wasn't the first to vanish on Lake Havers. She was simply the one we couldn't ignore. The influx of attention drew filmmakers, podcasters, and crime tourists. Each winter, small groups arrived to photograph the lake, their breath fogging the air like ghosts rehearsing tragedy. The sheriff's department posted signs warning against venturing onto the ice, but the signs themselves became props for visitors seeking authenticity. Businesses commodified the legend, cafes selling vanishing latte, souvenir shops printing "the lights went out" on mugs. Locals alternated between resentment and resignation. Tourism money repaired roads and docks, yet every sale felt like desecration. Helen Reiss remained the silent center of it all. Living alone in Concord, she received annual invitations to speak at memorial events and true crime conventions. She declined everyone. Her days followed quiet patterns: tending her garden, maintaining Ellen's archive of field notebooks, answering occasional correspondence from the scholarship recipients. That summer, she received a letter from a young researcher who'd used Ellen's dataset to identify a new microalgae species in Lake Champlain. The student named it Racia Ellenae. For the first time in years, Helen allowed herself to smile. "That's the right kind of legacy," she told the reporter who visited later. "Something that grows instead of erases." Despite closure, law enforcement continued small procedural reviews whenever new technology surfaced. In 2024, a company developing environmental DNA drones offered to resurvey the lake. The devices skimmed millimeters above the ice, collecting microparticles for analysis. Most samples yielded nothing unusual: pollen, bacterial spores, mineral dust. But one drone captured a sequence from beneath a fissure near the western bank, an area once inaccessible to divers. The DNA fragment matched neither Ellen nor Cleary. The profile was partial, degraded, likely contamination from old equipment, yet it rekindled the question of a second presence. The forensic report labeled it "unresolved contributor." The case remained closed, but internally the file acquired a new appendix marked "possible additional participant. No further action." When that detail leaked, online communities erupted with speculation. Threads multiplied. Maybe Cleary hadn't acted alone. Maybe someone had helped construct the false surface. Maybe Cleary had been covering for a superior from his fish and wildlife days. Each theory spun new branches, some accusing the state itself of orchestrating a cover-up. Helen refused interviews, but privately she wrote in her journal, "It's always easier to imagine more monsters than to accept one ordinary man." In late 2024, the Vermont Historical Society organized an exhibit titled "Frozen Evidence: The Science and Folklore of Lake Havers." It displayed Ellen's recovered field tools, the refrozen helmet, and a replica of Cleary's attic, reconstructed from forensic photographs. Visitors moved through dimly lit rooms where audio of wind and distant engines played continuously. The final panel displayed a timeline leading from Ellen's disappearance to the attic discovery, ending with an open question: what does it mean to solve a mystery? Reviews called the exhibit both chilling and dignified. Helen attended privately on opening day, arriving before the crowd. She stood before the display of her daughter's notebook, the one containing the note about neighbors' attic vents, and whispered, "You were right to look up." Outside the museum, fresh snow began to fall, the first storm of the season. Reporters waiting at the entrance caught sight of her but said nothing. She walked past them into the whiteness, her footprints filling almost as soon as they formed. That same winter, Dr. Cortez's research team published a final paper integrating satellite thermal imaging with historical weather data. The model simulated conditions from February 1999 and showed that the temperature differential near Cleary's property could have allowed a shallow cavity to remain hidden until the following thaw. The findings settled the last technical debate. The disappearance was no longer impossible. It was entirely explainable, physics manipulated by human hands. Yet the certainty felt hollow. A commentator in Scientific American wrote, "We solved the mechanism, but not the meaning." By 2025, interest in Lake Havers began to ebb, replaced by newer stories of unsolved vanishings elsewhere. But for the people who lived around the lake, the silence still carried memory. Each winter when the ice formed smooth and unbroken, they looked for faint glimmers beneath the surface, reflections of headlights that were not there. Some claimed to see two beams instead of one, as if another machine had followed Ellen that night. Whether illusion or echo, it kept the legend alive. In the final weeks of that year, Helen received a parcel from the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, personal effects released after evidence retention limits expired. Inside was Ellen's thermos, still labeled with masking tape. Field 3, caffeine. Helen filled it with coffee, drove north, and parked at the overlook above Lake Havers. The wind smelled of iron and pine. Below her, the lake stretched unblemished under moonlight. She unscrewed the lid, poured a small measure into the snow, and spoke softly into the night. "You came here for science. You left us a story. They're both still working." Then she drank the rest, lukewarm, metallic, and utterly real, unofficial. Archives, the Lake Havers file, occupies a single box among hundreds. Its label reads Case 99-041, Reiss, Ellen, Vermont Cold Case, closed. Inside lie photographs of tracks that vanish into darkness, fragments of fiberglass, and a handwritten line from Denton's notebook. The lake keeps its own record. No one has opened the box in years, yet dust patterns on the lid trace faint outlines like ripples in thin snow, reminders that even stillness can remember movement. By 2041, more than 40 years had passed since the night Ellen Reiss vanished across the ice. Vermont had changed in the slow, inevitable ways that cold places do. Population drawn to the cities. Lakeside cabins converted into short-term rentals for skiers who never learned the names of the people who once lived there. The house that had belonged to Norman Cleary no longer stood. A developer purchased the land in 2037, raised the structure, and built 4 minimalist vacation cottages under a rebranded name, Havers Retreat. The marketing copy omitted history. Quiet refuge, pure air, pristine water. Only locals still remembered, and even they had learned to package the memory for outsiders, selling cautionary tales with their maple syrup. The lake itself endured, changing only in color. Climate warming shortened its freeze season. Ice that once held through April now cracked by early March. The wind off the hills had softened, less biting, almost indifferent. Yet every year, around February, the old story returned. Someone would repost the archival photograph of the 2 beams of light vanishing across the lake. Someone would mention the helmet found upright on solid ice. Podcasts recycled it annually under new titles. Cold That Burns, The Frozen Thesis, When Lights Go Out. Most listeners assumed it had happened recently. Chronology dissolved in the endless circulation of tragedy. That winter, a new voice joined the cycle, May Denton, granddaughter of Deputy Miles Denton. She was 26, a digital archivist for the Vermont Historical Records Project, born long after the original investigation but raised on its echoes. Her grandfather's notebooks had passed to her father, then to her. Inside were brittle pages filled with meticulous handwriting, timestamps, and quiet fury. She had grown up hearing that Lake Havers had been both his greatest failure and his quiet redemption. When she read his final note, the lights never went out. "We just stopped looking in the dark." She decided that digital memory might do what human persistence could not: keep the dark searchable. May pitched a podcast to a small public media network, a 6-part serialized investigation using her grandfather's original recordings and field reports. She titled it The Havers File. Unlike sensational shows that dramatize the case, hers aimed for documentary precision. No music, no dramatization, just layered audio, wind, tape hiss, voice fragments, and archival readings. The first episode aired in January 2041. It began with her voice reading Ellen's field note from February 5, 1999. Neighbor's attic vents, possible. Contamination source, inspect insulation. Then silence, followed by Denton's voice from an old cassette. Impossible conditions. Vehicle missing without surface breach. The series gained traction quickly. Listeners were drawn to the intimacy of hearing a granddaughter argue with her grandfather's ghosts. May framed each episode as dialogue between generations, contrasting the analog slowness of 1999 with the hyper-documented now. She used digitized satellite data, scanned maps, and 3D terrain models to reconstruct the search. The tone was measured, forensic, almost academic. But what made it haunting was her restraint. "We keep looking for revelation," she said in one episode. But the record shows mostly repetition. During production, May accessed digital copies of Cleary's recovered notebooks stored at the Montpelier archives. Most pages were gibberish, technical scribbles mixed with obsessional fragments, but one entry arrested her. It contained a crude diagram of lake havers with markings labeled T1, T2, and T3, followed by coordinates. Cross-referencing with modern mapping software placed T2, not on the lake but beneath what was now a hiking trail near the northern tree line, about a quarter-mile from where Cleary's property once ended. Intrigued, May drove there in late February with a drone and ground sensor borrowed from her lab. The scan revealed an anomaly 3 meters below surface level, metallic density inconsistent with rock. She hesitated to report it officially. The site was private land now, part of Havers Retreat, owned by a Boston investment group. Still, the possibility of finding the missing snowmobile, the last physical remnant of the case, pulled at her. She sent an inquiry to the property manager under the pretense of environmental assessment. When the owner refused access, citing liability, May did what Denton might have done. She returned alone at night. Snow fell in thin glittering sheets. She carried a handheld scanner and an old flashlight that had belonged to her grandfather, its beam weak but steady. The coordinates led her to a clearing between birch trunks where the snow lay unusually smooth, as if compacted. The scanner chirped when it passed over the spot. Definite metallic reflection at shallow depth. She scraped at the surface, revealing a glint of blue paint dulled by corrosion. Her breath caught. The color was unmistakable. She photographed it, collected a microsample, then replaced the snow carefully. 2 days later, analysis confirmed the sample's composition, 1990s Yamaha polymer blend, identical to the fragments found at the highway rest stop in 1999. The snowmobile had been buried, not submerged. Cleary, or someone working with him, had moved it inland and covered it long before the search expanded that direction. The discovery upended the accepted reconstruction. Cleary had not simply hidden evidence, he had rewritten geography, turning the lake into a stage while concealing the truth within forest ground that no one thought to question. May presented her findings in the podcast's final episode. She spoke calmly, almost clinically, aware that what she revealed would reignite old arguments. "It was never the lake that kept secrets," she said. "It was the land. We thought in 2 dimensions, surface and depth, but Cleary thought in layers." The episode ended with the sound of snow falling on metal, recorded the night she found it. The final words were her grandfather's, spliced from tape. "Look closer. It's still there." The response was immediate. National media picked up the story. The Vermont Bureau reopened the site with official excavation teams. By March, they confirmed the presence of a snowmobile frame, its engine intact but corroded, serial number partially legible. In the trunk compartment, forensic analysts discovered remnants of synthetic fabric, likely Ellen's parka lining, and a small glass vial containing algae samples sealed with parafilm. The vial's label, written in Ellen's handwriting, read, "South Inlet Control 4." The contents had survived, frozen within the sealed capsule for 42 years. The find transformed the case from historical closure to living artifact. Universities petitioned to preserve the recovered items as part of a scientific archive rather than evidence. Helen, now in her 90s, approved the decision. She would have wanted it studied, she told reporters by video call. She didn't die for mystery. She died doing research. But the excavation revealed something else. A second set of footprints fossilized beneath the compacted soil layer, preserved in frozen clay. The treads were smaller than Cleary's boots, consistent with a lighter person, possibly female. Forensic reconstruction estimated their depth and orientation, as if someone had stood watching while the vehicle was covered. The prints did not match Ellen's known shoe size. The new hypothesis emerged quietly but relentlessly, that Cleary had not acted entirely alone. Archivists combed through the 1999 volunteer rosters. One name surfaced repeatedly: Mara Halverson, a graduate student who had assisted search operations in the early days and later moved out of state. Her interviews at the time described Cleary as helpful, quiet, unnerving. Records showed she had corresponded with him months before the disappearance regarding lake contamination studies. She had never been considered a suspect, nor had she returned to Vermont after 2001. When journalists tracked her to Oregon, she declined comment. For May, the revelation was both vindication and burden. Her podcast had reignited the world's fascination, but it had also reopened grief for families who had finally begun to rest. She ended the final episode with a simple statement: every case solved creates a new beginning for the unsolved parts. She refused to monetize the show, donating all proceeds to the Reiss Scholarship Fund. The network tried to persuade her to produce a second season. She declined. "There's nothing left to narrate," she said. "Only echoes." That spring, Helen received a small package from May. Inside, a digital drive containing restored recordings of Denton's original interviews and scans of Ellen's field maps. Attached was a note. "Your daughter's work is part of Vermont's scientific record again." The ice didn't win. Helen played one file at random. It was Ellen's voice, faint, distant, captured from an old microcassette she'd used for dictation during fieldwork. "Lake Havers, February 4th, the voice said, steady and analytical. "Wind calm, temperature -10. Testing control transect near neighbor's property. Birch pollen evident in drift. Interesting." Then static. The sound lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to restore the living timbre that memory had flattened. Helen wept silently, not from sadness but relief. The data had survived. When spring arrived, thawing the last remnants of ice, May visited the site one final time. The excavation pit had filled with meltwater, reflecting the sky in dull silver. She dropped a waterproof data chip into the water, her complete digital archive of the case, every file, every photograph, and watched it sink. "Let the lake keep the record," she whispered. That summer, the state erected a new plaque near the trailhead where the snowmobile was found. It bore two names, Ellen Reiss, 1972-1999, and Deputy Miles Denton, 1953-2022, with the inscription, "Science found her." Persistence found the rest. Visitors left flowers, photographs, and data tags encoded with personal notes. Some came for closure, others for curiosity. At dusk, the water reflected their silhouettes, merging into a single long shadow stretching toward the woods. By autumn, the viral storm faded. May's podcast, archived quietly into university repositories, cited in papers about digital preservation and intergenerational storytelling. Life around the lake resumed its slow rhythm. Only one mystery remained unsolved, the identity of the second set of footprints. Some said they were Cleary's earlier, mistaken for smaller due to melting. Others claimed they belonged to a rescuer long forgotten. May stopped speculating. She had learned that answers were only temporary states between silences. On the last page of her grandfather's journal, tucked behind a photograph of the frozen lake, she found an unfamiliar note in Ellen's handwriting, perhaps left in evidence decades before. "If the ice holds, look beneath the snow. It's never as empty as it seems." May framed it above her desk, beside a small sample vial labeled South Inlet, Control 4. The liquid inside remained clear, unclouded, alive. By 2061, Lake Havers had ceased to freeze entirely. Winters came gray and wet, the water restless even in January, reflecting a climate that no longer paused long enough to remember its own stillness. The people who once lived around the shoreline were gone or aged beyond memory. Cabins stood renovated into glass retreats for tourists who came not for the legend, but for quiet weekends disconnected from signal. Yet the old story endured, circulating in archives, classrooms, and digital forums as one of the most thoroughly documented unsolved mysteries of the late 20th century. Solved, yes, in the procedural sense, but never exhausted in meaning. At 96, Helen Reiss lived in a care facility in Burlington overlooking the same hills her daughter had loved to catalog for atmospheric profiles. Her mind wandered, lucid one hour, fragmented the next. She rarely spoke about the case anymore, though nurses sometimes heard her murmur scientific terms in her sleep. Chlorophyll, density gradient, stratification, as if reciting a private prayer. Her room contained few possessions. Ellen's field camera, a pressed birch leaf framed in glass, and a small hollow-screen loop of Lake Havers at dusk, captured decades earlier by May Denton's drone. When the image played, Helen's eyes followed the shimmer across the water, her gaze unblinking, her expression neither grief nor peace, but something quieter, calibration. May visited every few months. She was in her mid-40s now, head archivist for the New England Cold Case Digital Repository, a position that barely existed when her grandfather began scribbling notes by flashlight. Her hair had grayed early, streaked with silver that caught the same cold light that had once glared off Havers ice. The success of the Havers file had made her a reluctant figure in true crime scholarship, cited in journals that studied memory rather than mystery. She spent most days maintaining the living database of evidence, audio, photographs, recovered artifacts, all cross-referenced into a system designed to outlive its caretakers. When students asked why she still devoted time to a case long closed, she'd answer, "Because forgetting is the last crime we commit." That spring, she received an automated notification from the repository's forensic division. Old evidence samples from the Lake Havers excavation, once frozen in storage, were being cycled for digital reanalysis using nanoscale residue mapping. The algorithm flagged an anomaly. Trace compounds on the interior of the glass vial labeled South Inlet, Control 4. The original reports had logged the vial as sealed, untouched, containing only algae and lake sediment. But the new spectrograph detected faint residues of methyl isocyanate, a volatile compound not native to Vermont waters, commonly found in industrial degreasers used during the 1980s. Its presence suggested external contamination, possibly from Cleary's tools, possibly from an entirely different source. May examined the digital scans late one evening, rain tapping her office window. The residue pattern was inconsistent with accidental transfer. It formed a thin crescent along the interior lip of the vial, as though something had been deliberately applied before sealing. A label fragment under UV light revealed additional handwriting invisible in daylight. 2 faded letters. M.H. She froze. It was the same set of initials her grandfather had found on the old rescue photograph. Mark Havers. The discovery didn't rewrite the case so much as deepen its strata. If Mark Havers had handled the vial, it placed him at the site after or before the disappearance. But Mark himself had vanished in 1990, 9 years earlier. The simplest explanation was reuse. Cleary had salvaged old equipment marked by his former colleague. Yet May couldn't ignore the possibility that the contamination was temporal, a literal trace of continuity between 2 vanishings separated by a decade. She compiled her findings into an internal memo, but hesitated to publish. "Some mysteries don't resolve," she wrote, echoing her grandfather's phrasing. "They just change medium." When she next visited Helen, she brought a portable hollow tablet and projected the 3D model of the vial above the bed. The elderly woman watched silently as the residue's faint blue arc rotated in the air. May explained the discovery, careful not to frame it as revelation but as an additional variable. Helen listened, her expression unreadable. When the model dissolved, she said quietly, "He wasn't hiding from her. He was testing her." May frowned. "Who? Cleary?" Helen whispered. "He left puzzles for people who could think like she did. That was his real cruelty." Her eyes drifted toward the window where rain streaked the glass. But she won. The science outlasted him. 2 weeks later, Helen passed away in her sleep. Her will requested a modest cremation and for her ashes to be scattered at the north shore of Lake Havers, where Ellen's thermos had been found. May honored the request in late summer. The lake shimmered under heavy heat haze, dragonflies tracing erratic lines across the surface. There was no ice anymore, no visible trace of the landscape that had once trapped so much absence. She poured the ashes into the water. The wind shifted, carrying a fine gray mist toward the reeds. "That's the last calibration," she murmured. After the ceremony, May remained by the shore, scrolling through archived photographs. One image, the aerial shot from 1999 showing faint rectangular shadows in the ice, caught her attention. She enhanced it using new reconstruction filters unavailable decades earlier. The software rendered an overlay of thermal differentials and detected something overlooked: a thin, serpentine trail connecting the rectangle to the western shore, consistent with low-grade heat emission at the time of capture. It was not a snowmobile path. It was smaller, narrower, possibly the trail of a person moving alone in heavy clothing. The timestamp matched the night of February 6, 1999, hours after Ellen's last known movement. May stared at the readout, heart pounding. Whoever it was, they had crossed the lake after Ellen's disappearance, not before. The implication was vertiginous. Someone returned to the site while the search was already underway. Whether Cleary revisiting to adjust his staging or another hand verifying concealment, the trail existed as undeniable fact. She added the finding to the digital archive but resisted framing it as new evidence. "History isn't solved by proving who was there," she recorded in her log. "Only by admitting who looked away." In the years that followed, The Havers file became required study material for digital forensics courses. Students dissected the evolving case not to determine guilt, but to examine how data itself becomes narrative. Algorithms trained on the archive generated reconstructions of the lake across decades. Virtual winters where users could walk across simulated ice, watching the lights blink out and on again in endless repetition. Some called it art, others desecration. May remained ambivalent. If memory becomes interactive, she told an interviewer, maybe it stops being memory at all. By 2068, automation handled most archival maintenance. May retired quietly, leaving behind terabytes of structured silence. The Reiss Scholarship continued funding fieldwork in limnology and environmental DNA, its recipients scattering across continents. In scientific papers, Ellen's name appeared as citation, Reiss, E., 1999, unpublished field data, Lake Havers series. She had become data herself, integrated into the ecosystem she studied. On the 25th anniversary of the case's closure, a group of environmental historians visited the lake with AR lenses that superimposed historical imagery onto the modern landscape. Standing on the soft banks, they watched reconstructed snowmobiles glide across unfrozen water, light beams cutting through phantom fog. In the overlay, Ellen appeared briefly, a digital composite extrapolated from photographs, kneeling by a core sample, expression-focused, alive within the algorithmic reconstruction. For a moment she seemed real. Enough to reach. Then the simulation reset, and the surface returned to mirror stillness. That evening, far from the crowd, May sat at her home desk reviewing the day's recordings. She played one final file recovered from Denton's original cassette tapes, newly digitized and remastered by AI. It was a fragment barely 30 seconds long, ambient wind, creaking ice, and his voice whispering into the recorder. There's something about silence. You can hear it, remember. She let it loop, volume low, until the line blurred with the hum of modern electronics. Outside, rain fell again, warm, unseasonal, pattering on the windows like thawing snow. She imagined the lake, dark and liquid, holding layers of stories compressed like ice cores. The surface reflected nothing, yet beneath it lay a continuum of sound, data, memory, and absence, all indistinguishable now. In the end, there was no monster, no secret society, no supernatural closure, only human curiosity meeting its own reflection. Ellen had sought to measure purity in water. The world had measured her absence instead. Before shutting down the terminal, May added one last annotation to the archive's metadata file, a single line under Status, Case Complete, Persistence Confirmed. Then she switched off the monitor. The screen went black, showing her own faint reflection superimposed over the frozen lake wallpaper that never thawed. The room filled with the quiet hum of machines preserving everything. And outside, the rain kept falling, soft and endless, like the sound of ice reforming in memory.